Welcome back to Maine Believers. My name is William, and this is part 3 of our series on morality. Today we'll be discussing why objective morality, or objective right and wrong, cannot be based upon the natural world and cannot be a result of the process of evolution. I have 2 main reasons for this belief. My first is the existence of altruism, or self-sacrifice, and my second is the is-ought fallacy. So without any further ado, let's get into today's video and discover why it is impossible to derive objective right and wrong from the natural world and the processes that drive it. So before we go any further, let me explain or define what I mean by naturalism and why it's important to discuss whether or not objective right and wrong can be based upon the natural world. When I say materialism, I am referring to the belief or the worldview that all that there is the physical. All that there is the natural world around us, and that everything originated from one starting molecule. And over billions of years of unorchestrated or unguided evolution, we got to the point where we are today. So from that point of view, every trait that human beings have, every feeling and emotion that we have, should be able to be grounded or based upon or somehow connected to that evolutionary process. Since if there is no God, it gave us everything that we have today. Now, the reason this is important is because if I can show that it's impossible to derive objective morality from the natural process of evolution, and that in fact evolution and morality contradict each other, then that might just point to something outside of evolution. That might just be evidence that there is a God or a mind in which morality is based. So what is evolution? Well, evolution is the natural selection process from an atheistic worldview that over billions of years selected those traits that are conducive or beneficial to the survival of the individual molecule which manifests in the person. Basically, it's just unorchestrated random mutation and selection of those traits that are good or help our species survive. And so with that definition in mind, let's see whether or not morality can be grounded in that process of evolution. So as I alluded to in the introduction for this video, there are 2 main reasons why I believe that this is not possible, why I believe that we cannot derive objective right and wrong as we know them from the evolutionary process and the natural world. And the first reason is the existence of altruism. Now you might be like, what in the world is altruism? So let me give a brief definition. Altruism is simply selfless concern for others, sometimes at the cost of our own preservation and safety. Now, as a whole, this concept is very hard to explain from an evolutionary worldview. After all, if evolution is driven by anything, it is driven by the selfish preservation of only those traits that are conducive to the survival of the molecule which manifests in the individual. But maybe something inside of us caused us to rebel against those genes. Maybe something inside of us caused us to rebel against our selfish genes. Richard Dawkins calls this the rebellious gene. And this doesn't really make any sense to me, because why would we have a desire to rebel to begin with? But I could understand how sometimes being selfless or looking out for the good of the community in the long run could be conducive to the survival of the individual. But there's one case in which this is not true, and that is selfless concern for those who take away more from society than they contribute from a survival standpoint. If you look at animals in the wild, especially in Africa and the safari, where there's these giant herds of water buffaloes, those who are crippled and old are often left behind for the predators to eat so that the rest of the herd can survive. But this is not the same with humans. In human culture, in society, we view those who are elderly or severely mentally and physically handicapped as worthy of our protection and preservation, and just as equal as any of us to life, and to a fulfilling life at that. But why is this? Why is it that we say it's virtuous to look out for those who take away more from society than they contribute from a naturalistic worldview, and if anything, inhibit or stand in the way in the progression of our species to what evolution has in plan for us? It's impossible. It's impossible to find a natural foundation or a natural source for that notion. If we are here because of evolution, and if all morality can be derived from the evolutionary process, then we should be able to find an explanation for selflessness and for the idea that it is virtuous to look after and preserve those who drain from society more than they give, and yet we cannot. In fact, if we took evolution and we said it was the moral standard and we tried to derive objective right and wrong from the evolutionary process as we have observed it, we would get things that we would call absolutely invirtuous or horrible or even evil, such as the eugenics movement. I think most of you will agree that it is bad, it is evil to kill people just because they are mentally impaired. And yet, if we look at the evolutionary process, that is something that we would conclude was virtuous, if virtue was derived from evolution. My point is that altruism, especially selfless concern for the handicapped and the disabled, is unconnected or uncompatible with the evolutionary process, and the notion that it is virtuous cannot be derived from the natural world. All right, so now let's get into point number 2, the second reason why I believe it's impossible to say that objective morality comes from evolution. And this second reason is the famous or infamous, depending on who you are, is-ought fallacy. Now, the is-ought fallacy was first articulated by David Hume, who was a philosopher in the 1700s. Hume was not a Christian, but he was doing some research on philosophies and particularly morals. And he observed that most of the great philosophers of history start with observations of what is and conclude their writings with observations of what should be or shouldn't be. And he said this is impossible. He said this is a category error. We cannot look at what is and come to a conclusion that it shouldn't be any different than as we observe it to be without there being something outside of what is. I admit this concept can be a little hard to understand, so I came up with a brief illustration to maybe make it a little easier to grasp. Let's say that I have a blank canvas and a vase of flowers. I want to put a perfect rendition of the flowers on the blank canvas. So I take out my paint, and with every stroke of paint I put onto the canvas, I'm either getting closer to a perfect rendition of the flowers next to the canvas or further away from a perfect rendition of the flowers next to the canvas. The flowers stand as a kind of standard against which I am able to measure the canvas. And using the standard of the flowers, I can say that the painting is either good or bad based off how closely it replicates the flowers I am trying to paint. Now let's remove the flowers from the picture. Let's say that I just have a canvas and some paints, and I just start randomly putting brush strokes on the canvas. I finish my painting, but I can neither say that it is good nor bad if I have nothing to measure it against. So how does this transfer to the world we live in? Well, let's say that you and I are the canvas. Our lives, the world around us is the canvas. Everything that happens is the brushstrokes on the canvas. If the canvas just exists, if all that exists is the natural world and the physical properties around us, then we cannot say that they should be different than what they are, because they are what they are and there's nothing to measure them against. But if there's something outside of this world, if there's something outside of the canvas against what happens within the canvas is measured, or what happens within our lives is measured, then we can say that things ought to be different than they are. My point is that if all that exists is the physical world, and all that exists is our observations of how it operates, then we should have no reason to conclude that it should be any different than it is. And yet we do. And yet we say the things that happen in this world should not happen, and things that don't happen in this world should happen. And we make reasonable conclusions or logical conclusions about what is virtuous and what is not virtuous. Where do we get this idea of virtue? It cannot come from the natural world without there being something outside of the natural. You have to have a standard against which you measure the natural, and that standard cannot be the natural itself. Natural laws are simply observations of what happens over and over again. And yet moral laws are observations of what should happen even though it doesn't. All right, I am freezing, but before I go, let me just do a brief recap of what we have covered in this video. We started out by defining what evolution is and what the natural world is, and why, if there is no God, we should be able to derive everything in this world, including objective morality, from the natural world and the process of evolution that got us to where we are today, from an atheistic worldview. Then we discussed my top 2 reasons for believing that it is impossible to derive objective morality from the purely natural world. Reason number 1, the existence of altruism or selflessness, and the notion or the belief that we have that it is virtuous to look out for those who inhibit, from a naturalistic worldview, the progression of the species. Why is it that we call it good to do something that seems to contradict evolution if morality is derived from evolution? My second point was the is-ought fallacy, or the dilemma that you cannot derive an ought to or should be value from an observation of what is. If all that exists is the natural world, and there is nothing outside of it, then we cannot say that it should be any different than it is, and yet we do. So hopefully this video was helpful to you guys. Hopefully it helped you better understand why we cannot derive objective right and wrong from just the natural world. If you have a disagreement or a question, because I know this is probably going to be a pretty controversial video, please feel free to put it in the comment section. Keep it concise and polite, but feel free to put any questions or comments down there. I will do my best at the end of the month to do a video where I address the top 5 or 10 comments on all of my videos.